My name is Victoria Morgan, and at 34 I stood on the red carpet at the Emmy Awards, holding the golden statue I had just won for Best Documentary Director. As cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, all I could think about was the man who had spent 15 years telling me I would never amount to anything, that I was just a burden he had inherited when he married my mother. My stepfather, Richard Blackwood, had made it crystal clear that I would never truly be family, that his precious biological children would always come first, and that keeping my birth father's last name was a constant reminder of my outsider status. What he didn't know, as he watched my acceptance speech from his living room that night, was that I had spent the last decade deliberately building my career to ensure that the Morgan name would become far more famous and respected than his could ever be. But before I tell you how I turned his rejection into my greatest motivation, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Because this is a story about proving that blood doesn't make family, but it sure can make headlines. I was 7 years old when my mother, Elizabeth, married Richard Blackwood, a successful real estate developer who seemed like the answer to all our financial struggles. My biological father, David Morgan, had died in a car accident when I was 4, leaving behind only memories I struggled to hold on to and a trust fund that wouldn't be accessible until I turned 25. Mom had been working 2 jobs to support us in our cramped apartment, and Richard's proposal offered the security and stability she desperately wanted for both of us. His colonial mansion in an upscale neighborhood represented everything she had dreamed of providing for me, and I could see the relief in her eyes when she said yes to his proposal. Richard already had 2 children from his previous marriage, Marcus, who was 9, and Sophia, who was 6. They lived with us full-time after their mother had relocated to California for work, making the transition to our new blended family even more complex. From the very beginning, the household dynamics made it clear that I was the outsider looking in. Richard was polite but distant with me, treating me more like a guest than a family member. He would ask about my day at dinner, but his attention would immediately shift to Marcus and Sophia when they spoke. When he helped with homework, it was always their assignments that got priority. "Victoria can work on hers in her room," he would say when I approached the kitchen table where he was helping Marcus with math. "I need to focus on helping my son right now." The distinction between my son and just Victoria was subtle but consistent. I was never my daughter, or even our daughter. I was simply Victoria, the child who happened to live in his house. The name issue became a source of constant tension. Richard had assumed that I would take the Blackwood name when he married my mother, symbolically becoming part of his family. When Mom explained that I wanted to keep my father's surname to honor his memory, Richard's disappointment was obvious. "It's going to be confusing," he argued during one of their discussions that I overheard from the top of the stairs. "The kids at school will wonder why she has a different name. It makes the family look fractured." "She's only 7, Richard," Mom replied gently. "David is her father, and she should have that connection to him." "David is dead," Richard said bluntly. "I'm the one raising her now. I'm the one providing for her. She should carry the name of the man who's actually taking care of her." But Mom held firm on this point, one of the few times she would advocate for my wishes over Richard's preferences. I remained Victoria Morgan, though I could sense Richard's resentment about it every time he had to explain to his friends why his stepdaughter had a different last name. The favoritism became more pronounced as we all adjusted to living together. Marcus and Sophia received new clothes regularly, had their own bedrooms decorated exactly how they wanted, and were enrolled in expensive extracurricular activities. I wore hand-me-downs from Sophia, shared my mother's small home office as a bedroom until a proper room could be arranged in the basement, and was told that piano lessons weren't in the budget right now. "We have to be practical about expenses," Richard would say when I asked about activities that Marcus and Sophia took for granted. "3 children is expensive and we need to prioritize necessities." But Marcus's hockey equipment and Sophia's dance classes were apparently necessities, while my art supplies and books were luxuries. The emotional distance was even more painful than the material differences. Richard never hugged me, never attended my school events unless Mom specifically asked him to, and never showed interest in my accomplishments. When I won the school's Young Artist Award in 4th grade, he congratulated me politely and then immediately started discussing Marcus's soccer team's chances in the playoffs. I learned to compete for attention in a household where my successes were acknowledged but never celebrated, where my needs were addressed but never prioritized, and where my presence was tolerated but never truly welcomed. Mom tried to bridge the gap between Richard and me, but she was also navigating her own adjustment to being married to a man with strong opinions about family hierarchy and discipline. She had gone from being a single mother with complete autonomy to being a wife in a household where Richard's preferences shaped most decisions. "Give him time," she would tell me when I complained about feeling excluded. "He's not used to having a little girl in the house, he'll warm up to you." But months turned into years, and the warmth never came. If anything, Richard seemed to become more distant as I grew older, and more aware of the family dynamics. The breaking point came when I was 12, during a family vacation to Richard's parents' lake house. His extended family was gathering to celebrate his father's 70th birthday, and I was excited about the trip because I rarely got to experience the kind of large family gatherings that Marcus and Sophia took for granted. The lake house was beautiful, with multiple bedrooms, a private dock, and enough space for the entire Blackwood clan to spread out comfortably. Richard's siblings and their children filled the house with laughter and conversation, creating the warm family atmosphere I had always craved. But as the weekend progressed, I realized that while I was included in activities, I wasn't truly included in the family. The other relatives knew Marcus and Sophia's preferences, interests, and achievements. They asked detailed questions about their school performances and future plans. With me, the conversations were polite, but surface level. "And this is Victoria," Richard would say when introducing me to relatives I hadn't met before, "Elizabeth's daughter." Not our daughter or my stepdaughter or even part of the family, just Elizabeth's daughter, as if my presence needed explanation and apologizing. The distinction became painfully clear during the birthday dinner for Richard's father. Grandpa Blackwood gave heartfelt toasts to each of his biological grandchildren, sharing memories and expressing pride in their accomplishments. When he mentioned me, it was a brief, polite acknowledgement of my presence. "And we're happy to have Victoria with us as well," he said, raising his glass in my direction. "She's a lovely addition to our family gatherings." An addition, not a member, but an addition. That night, as I lay in the bunk bed I was sharing with Sophia while Marcus got his own room, I overheard a conversation between Richard and his brother that would shape my understanding of my place in this family forever. "She seems like a nice kid," Uncle James was saying, apparently referring to me. "She is," Richard replied. "Smart, well-behaved, no real problems. But it's complicated, you know, she's not really mine." "But you've been raising her for 5 years now," James pointed out. "Raising her, yes, but there's a difference between taking care of someone and having them be truly yours," Richard explained. "Marcus and Sophia are my blood. They carry my name, they have my genes, they're part of my legacy. Victoria, she's Elizabeth's daughter. I'm doing my duty by her, but she'll never be family the way my own children are." "Have you considered adoption?" James asked. "Making it official?" Richard's laugh was dismissive. "She doesn't want to change her name, and honestly, I'm not sure I want that level of legal responsibility. When she turns 18, she'll go her own way. My obligation is to get her to adulthood safely, not to make her a permanent part of the Blackwood family." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was 12 years old, and the man who had been my primary father figure for 5 years had just articulated that I was a temporary obligation rather than a permanent family member. I spent the rest of that weekend watching the family dynamics with new eyes, seeing how Richard's vision of temporary custody versus permanent family membership played out in countless small interactions. Marcus and Sophia were investments in the family future. I was an expense to be managed until I aged out of the system. When we returned home from the lake house, I made a decision that would guide the rest of my childhood and adolescence. If Richard didn't consider me family, then I would stop trying to earn his acceptance. Instead, I would focus on honoring the family name I actually carried and building something that would make the Morgan name mean something significant. I threw myself into academic and creative pursuits with an intensity that surprised everyone, including myself. I spent hours in the school library researching my father's family history, learning about the Morgan family's contributions to our community, and trying to understand the legacy I was meant to continue. My father had been a journalist before his death, working for the local newspaper and apparently showing promise as an investigative reporter. I found articles he had written about local politics and community issues, pieces that demonstrated integrity and commitment to truth that I wanted to emulate. I joined the school newspaper in 7th grade and discovered that I had inherited his talent for storytelling and his instinct for uncovering important information. My articles about budget cuts affecting arts programs and cafeteria food quality standards earned recognition from teachers and administrators. "You have a real gift for this," said Mrs. Peterson, my English teacher and newspaper advisor. "Have you considered journalism as a career?" The suggestion sparked something in me that went beyond simple academic interest. Journalism could be more than a career. It could be a way to build a reputation and legacy that honored my father's memory while establishing my own independent identity. At home, my increasing focus on school and extracurricular activities was viewed with mild approval by Richard, who appreciated that I wasn't causing problems or requiring additional resources. "Victoria's very self-sufficient," he would tell people when they asked about me. "Never any trouble, always keeps herself busy." Self-sufficient. The description was accurate, but also revealed how little he understood about what drove my constant activity. I wasn't naturally self-sufficient. I had learned to be independent because depending on his emotional support was unreliable and disappointing. Mom was supportive of my academic achievements but worried that I was pushing myself too hard. "Sweetie, you don't have to prove anything to anyone," she said when she found me working on a school project at midnight. "Richard is proud of you. We all are." But I knew that Richard's pride was different from the pride he felt for Marcus and Sophia. His approval of me was conditional and superficial, based on my ability to avoid being a burden rather than on genuine emotional investment in my success. High school brought new opportunities to distinguish myself and new challenges in navigating family dynamics. I was accepted into advanced placement classes, elected to student government, and offered leadership positions in multiple clubs. My journalism work expanded beyond the school newspaper to freelance pieces for the local paper. Meanwhile, Marcus was struggling academically and socially. His grades were mediocre, he had been caught drinking at a party, and his attitude toward family responsibilities was increasingly defiant. Sophia was performing well in school but had developed expensive tastes in clothes and activities that strained even Richard's generous budget. The contrast between my achievements and his biological children's struggles seemed to make Richard more resentful rather than more appreciative of my contributions to the family reputation. "Victoria's always been the easy one," he would say when people commented on my accomplishments. "Some kids are just naturally self-motivated." The implication was that my success required no effort or investment from him, while Marcus and Sophia's challenges were normal and expected parts of parenting that deserved his attention and resources. The college application process highlighted these disparities in ways that became impossible to ignore. Richard hired a private college counselor for Marcus and Sophia, invested in SAT prep courses, and arranged campus visits to expensive private schools. For me, college planning was a conversation over dinner where Richard suggested I look into state schools and merit scholarships. "You're smart enough to get financial aid," he said, matter-of-factly, "and in-state tuition is much more reasonable than these private colleges." "What about my trust fund from Dad?" I asked. "I'll have access to that when I turn 25. Richard's expression darkened slightly. "That money should be saved for your future, not spent on an overpriced undergraduate degree. You can get just as good an education at the state university." The hypocrisy was stunning. Marcus was being encouraged to apply to expensive private colleges that would cost more than my entire trust fund, while I was directed toward budget options despite having my own financial resources. But the conversation also clarified something important. My father's trust fund represented independence that Richard couldn't control or limit. Whatever money David Morgan had left for me would be mine alone, free from Richard's influence or approval. I researched the trust fund details and discovered that my father had been more financially successful than I had realized. The trust was worth nearly $400,000, enough to fund graduate school and provide a foundation for independent living. More importantly, it came with a stipulation that reflected David Morgan's values. The money could only be used for education, business investment, or charitable purposes. My father had wanted to ensure that his legacy would support meaningful accomplishments rather than frivolous spending. The restriction felt like guidance from beyond the grave, encouraging me to use his gift to build something significant. I was accepted to Northwestern University's journalism program with a partial scholarship, and between the financial aid and my planned use of the trust fund, I could afford the education I wanted without depending on Richard's support. When I announced my college plans at dinner, the family reaction was revealing. "Northwestern is a great school," Mom said with genuine excitement. "I'm so proud of you for getting in." "It's very expensive," Richard observed. "Are you sure the debt load is worth it?" "I'll be using my trust fund," I replied. "Dad wanted me to have a good education." Sophia looked up from her phone with sudden interest. "How much money did your real dad leave you?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Real dad was how the Blackwood children had started referring to David Morgan when they wanted to distinguish him from Richard, usually in contexts that suggested he was somehow less legitimate than their father. "Enough for college and graduate school," I answered diplomatically. Marcus snorted. "Lucky you. Some of us have to depend on our parents for college funding." The resentment in his voice was unmistakable. My financial independence represented a freedom that he and Sophia didn't have, and it clearly bothered them. "Victoria's father made different provisions," Richard said stiffly. "We'll handle Marcus and Sophia's education costs as a family." The distinction was clear. My education was funded by my real father's legacy, while Marcus and Sophia's education was a family investment. I was still an outsider, even when it came to financial planning. College at Northwestern was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was in an environment where my achievements were celebrated without qualification, where my background was interesting rather than problematic, and where my ambitions were encouraged without limitation. My journalism professors recognized my talent and pushed me to develop it further. I worked on the student newspaper, interned at Chicago media outlets, and began building a portfolio of work that demonstrated both technical skill and editorial vision. But perhaps more importantly, I was surrounded by peers who came from diverse family situations and who didn't view my complicated stepfamily dynamics as unusual or problematic. Many of my friends had divorced parents, complicated custody arrangements, or blended families with their own challenges. "Family is complicated for everyone," my roommate Sarah said when I shared some of my frustrations about feeling like an outsider in the Blackwood household. "The people who matter are the ones who support your dreams, not necessarily the ones who share your address." The perspective was liberating. I had spent years trying to earn a place in Richard's family when I should have been focusing on building relationships with people who valued and supported me. During my sophomore year, I decided to do an investigative piece for the student newspaper about real estate development practices in suburban Chicago. The topic was partly inspired by my desire to understand Richard's business better, but it evolved into something much more significant. Through interviews with local officials, community activists, and former Blackwood development employees, I uncovered a pattern of questionable practices that bordered on corruption. Richard's company had been using political connections to secure favorable zoning changes, manipulating environmental impact studies, and pressuring local officials to approve projects that benefited developers at the expense of community interests. The story I wrote was meticulously researched and carefully fact-checked, but it was also damning in its portrait of an industry that prioritized profit over community welfare. When it was published in the student newspaper, it caught the attention of Chicago media outlets and local government investigators. I didn't set out to damage Richard's reputation, but I also didn't shy away from the implications of what I had discovered. The story was accurate, important, and representative of the kind of journalism I wanted to practice. The fallout was swift and severe. Richard was furious when he learned about the article, though he tried to control his reaction in front of my mother. "This is what we get for sending her to that liberal university," he complained during a phone call I overheard when I was home for winter break. "They've filled her head with anti-business propaganda." Mom tried to defend me. "Richard, she's studying journalism. Investigating local issues is part of her education." "Investigating her own family is not education," he replied coldly. "It's betrayal." The word betrayal stung, but it also clarified something important about Richard's expectations. He viewed family loyalty as requiring blind support for his business practices, regardless of their ethical implications. When he confronted me directly about the article, his mask of polite tolerance finally dropped completely. "What you did was unconscionable," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. You attacked my business, my reputation, and my ability to provide for this family. I reported on public records and interviewed sources about industry practices, I replied calmly. I didn't attack anyone personally. You used information and access that came from being part of this family to damage that same family, he continued. That's the definition of betrayal. I'm not part of this family, I said quietly. You've made that clear my entire life. Richard's face reddened. We've provided for you, housed you, clothed you, and paid for your education. If that doesn't create obligations, then you're more selfish than I thought. You fulfilled your legal obligations, I replied, but you've never treated me like family, so don't expect me to prioritize your interests over journalistic integrity. The conversation ended with Richard making his position crystal clear. You want to be Victoria Morgan instead of accepting the Blackwood name? Fine. But don't expect Blackwood support when your Morgan legacy doesn't provide enough. It was the last meaningful conversation we would have for several years. I spent the rest of college building my journalism career with single-minded focus. I interned at major news outlets, won awards for investigative reporting, and graduated summa cum laude with job offers from multiple media organizations. More importantly, I had discovered my calling in documentary journalism. The combination of investigative research, narrative storytelling, and visual communication appealed to every aspect of my interests and abilities. I chose to start my career at a small but respected documentary production company in New York, working as a research assistant on projects that covered social justice issues, political corruption, and corporate malfeasance. The work was challenging and poorly paid, but it was also exactly what I wanted to be doing. I was building expertise in the kind of journalism that could make a real difference in people's lives while establishing my professional reputation. My relationship with my family during this period was minimal and strained. I called Mom regularly, but conversations were awkward when Richard was around. Marcus and Sophia were busy with their own college experiences and had little interest in maintaining contact with their stepsister who had embarrassed the family. The emotional distance was painful but also liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't trying to earn approval from people who had never been prepared to give it. My first big break came 3 years into my career when I was assigned to research a documentary about predatory lending practices. The project put me in contact with families who had lost their homes to foreclosure, community activists fighting against exploitative development, and whistleblowers from within the real estate and banking industries. The parallels to my college investigation were obvious, but the scope and impact were much larger. We were documenting a pattern of systemic abuse that affected thousands of families across multiple states. My research was so thorough and my understanding of the industry was so sophisticated that the director asked me to co-produce the documentary. It was an incredible opportunity for someone with my limited experience, but it was also a chance to prove myself on a national stage. The Real Cost of the American Dream premiered at Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim and commercial success. The documentary exposed the human cost of predatory development practices and helped inspire legislative reforms that protected vulnerable communities. More personally, the film established my reputation as a documentary filmmaker with expertise in investigating corporate misconduct and its impact on ordinary families. The success led to other opportunities, bigger budgets, and more prestigious projects. Over the next 5 years, I directed documentaries about environmental justice, corporate whistleblowing, and political corruption that earned both critical recognition and audience engagement. Each project built my reputation and expanded my professional network. The Morgan name became associated with hard-hitting documentary journalism that wasn't afraid to challenge powerful interests. But it was my 6th documentary, Family Secrets: The Hidden Cost of Loyalty, that would prove to be my breakthrough into mainstream recognition. The film examined how family businesses sometimes operated as criminal enterprises, using blood relationships and emotional manipulation to avoid accountability for illegal practices. I interviewed children of mob bosses, corporate executives, and political dynasties who had struggled with the choice between family loyalty and ethical responsibility. The documentary was deeply personal for me, though I never explicitly discussed my own family situation on camera. Every interview I conducted, every story I uncovered, reflected my own journey from trying to earn acceptance within a family structure that wasn't designed to include me. Family Secrets premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival and was subsequently picked up by a major streaming platform for global distribution. The critical response was overwhelmingly positive, with reviewers praising both the investigative depth and the emotional authenticity of the storytelling. More importantly, the film resonated with audiences who recognized their own family struggles in the stories I had documented. Viewers wrote to thank me for giving voice to experiences they had never seen reflected in media. The success of Family Secrets led to Emmy nominations in 3 categories: Best Documentary, Best Direction, and Best Writing. I was 34 years old and had achieved a level of professional recognition that exceeded my wildest dreams. The Emmy Awards ceremony was held at the Microsoft Theater in Los Angeles, with an audience of industry professionals and global media coverage. I had been nominated before but never won, so my expectations were modest. When they announced my name as the winner for Best Documentary Director, the moment felt surreal. I walked to the stage in a daze, holding the golden statue and trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. My acceptance speech was brief and focused on thanking the sources who had trusted me with their stories and the colleagues who had supported my work. But I concluded with words that were specifically intended for one audience member who I knew would be watching from home. This award represents the power of independent journalism and the importance of holding powerful institutions accountable, I said, looking directly into the camera. It also represents the legacy of my father, David Morgan, whose commitment to truth and justice continues to inspire my work. The Morgan name stands for integrity, courage, and the belief that everyone deserves to have their stories told. The speech was professional and appropriate, but Richard would understand the personal message embedded within it. The Morgan name was now associated with national recognition and respected accomplishment, while his Blackwood name remained known primarily within his local business community. The media coverage that followed the Emmy win was extensive and uniformly positive. Articles about my career and personal background appeared in major publications, complete with photos and biographical details that prominently featured my connection to my late father's legacy. Victoria Morgan's Emmy win caps remarkable rise in documentary journalism, read the headline in Variety. The article traced my career from college newspaper investigations to Emmy recognition, emphasizing my independence and integrity as defining characteristics. But perhaps more satisfying was the local coverage in Chicago media, where my win was reported as a hometown success story. The articles mentioned my Chicago area roots and my early work investigating local development practices, creating exactly the kind of professional recognition that Richard valued most. I knew he would read those articles, and I knew he would recognize that the Morgan name was now more famous and respected in his own professional community than the Blackwood name could ever be. The phone call from Mom came 2 days after the Emmy ceremony. "Victoria, sweetheart, congratulations on your big win," she said, her voice filled with genuine pride and excitement. "We watched the ceremony and we're so proud of you." "Thank you, Mom," I replied. "It's been an incredible experience." "Richard wanted me to tell you that he's very impressed with your accomplishments," she continued carefully. "He recognizes how hard you've worked to build your career." The message was clearly scripted, an attempt to bridge the years of distance without requiring Richard to make a direct apology or acknowledgement of his past behavior. "I appreciate that," I said diplomatically. "How is everyone doing?" Mom updated me on family news. Marcus was working in Richard's business but struggling with the responsibilities. Sophia had graduated from college but was living at home while figuring out her career direction, and Richard was dealing with increased competition and regulatory scrutiny in his industry. The subtext was clear. While I had been building a nationally recognized career, Richard's biological children were struggling to find their footing, and his business was facing challenges that made my early investigations seem prescient rather than disloyal. "Marcus especially wanted me to congratulate you," Mom added. "He said he's been following your career and he's impressed with what you've accomplished." The attempt at reconciliation was touching but also frustrating. My family was proud of my success now that it was nationally recognized, but they had shown little interest in supporting me during the years when I was building the foundation for that success. Over the next few months, I received several indirect overtures from various family members. Marcus connected with me on social media and began commenting supportively on my posts. Sophia shared articles about my Emmy win on her own social platforms. Richard even had Mom mention that he had been asked about me by business associates who had seen the coverage. But none of them contacted me directly, and none of them acknowledged the years of emotional distance and conditional acceptance that had shaped our relationships. The validation of my success was satisfying, but it also highlighted how shallow their previous rejection had been. They hadn't disapproved of my character or my choices, they had simply been unimpressed with my achievements until those achievements became prestigious enough to reflect positively on them. My next documentary project gave me an opportunity to address this dynamic more directly. The Price of Acceptance examined how family relationships change when one member achieves unexpected success, and how that success can reveal the conditional nature of family support. I interviewed adult children who had been rejected by their families for pursuing unconventional careers, only to be welcomed back when those careers became successful. I spoke with parents who admitted they had been wrong to discourage their children's ambitions. I documented the complex emotions involved in forgiving family members who had failed to provide support during difficult times. The documentary was deeply personal without being autobiographical. I used my own experiences to inform the questions I asked and the stories I chose to highlight, but I maintained professional objectivity throughout the production. When The Price of Acceptance premiered at Cannes Film Festival, the response was immediate and powerful. Critics praised the film's nuanced exploration of family dynamics and its compassionate but unflinching examination of how success changes relationships. More importantly, the film sparked conversations about family support, conditional love, and the responsibility of parents to encourage their children's dreams, even when those dreams don't align with their own expectations. The success of this second Emmy-nominated documentary solidified my reputation as a filmmaker who could address complex social issues with both analytical rigor and emotional authenticity. I was now recognized as one of the leading documentary directors of my generation, with a body of work that had influenced both public policy and cultural conversations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Northwestern University invited me to deliver the commencement address for their journalism school, honoring me as a distinguished alumna who had exemplified the values of independent investigative reporting. Standing at the podium where I had once been a student, addressing graduates who reminded me of my younger self, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Success isn't about earning approval from people who weren't prepared to support your dreams, I told the graduating class. Success is about building something meaningful that honors the values you inherited from people who did believe in your potential. After the ceremony, I was approached by a young graduate student who introduced herself as researching family business ethics. "Ms. Morgan," she said, "I've watched all your documentaries, and they've really influenced my thinking about corporate responsibility and family dynamics. I wanted to thank you for creating work that addresses these issues so thoughtfully." "What's your focus area?" I asked. "Actually, I'm investigating real estate development practices in suburban Chicago," she replied. "Some of the patterns you documented in your early work are still happening, just with different companies." I smiled at the irony. My college investigation had inspired other young journalists to continue examining the industry that Richard worked in. "Have you looked at Blackwood development?" I asked casually. "Yes, actually," she said. "They're one of the companies that's been flagged for questionable practices. They seem to have scaled back their operations significantly over the past few years." The information confirmed what I had suspected from Mom's updates. Richard's business was struggling, partly due to increased scrutiny of the kind of practices I had first exposed in my college investigation. That evening, at the alumni reception following the commencement ceremony, I was surrounded by successful graduates who credited my work with inspiring their own careers in investigative journalism. "You've become the role model for our entire program," said Professor Williams, who had been my undergraduate advisor. "Students regularly cite your work as an example of how documentary filmmaking can create social change." The recognition was gratifying, but it was also bittersweet. I had achieved everything I had dreamed of professionally, but the family relationships that should have been celebrating these accomplishments remained distant and complicated. Later that night, in my hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Richard directly for the first time in nearly a decade. "Richard, this is Victoria," I said when he answered the phone. The pause before he responded told me he was as surprised as I was by the call. "Victoria," he said carefully, "congratulations on your recent success. Elizabeth tells me you've been receiving quite a bit of recognition." "Thank you," I replied. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Another pause. "All right. I've spent the last 15 years building a career that would make the Morgan name mean something significant," I began. "I've succeeded beyond anything I imagined when I was growing up in your house." "You have," he agreed cautiously. "But I realize now that I was trying to prove something that didn't need proving." I continued. "You were right when you said I would never be a Blackwood. I didn't need to be, I was always meant to be a Morgan." Richard was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Victoria, I may have handled things poorly when you were growing up. I didn't understand how to be a stepfather to a child who was so different from my own children." "Different how?" I asked. "More driven, more independent, more focused on long-term goals," he admitted. "Marcus and Sophia needed more guidance and structure. You seemed to know what you wanted from an early age." "I knew I wanted to belong somewhere," I corrected gently. "When I couldn't find that belonging in your family, I decided to build something of my own." "And you've done that," Richard said. "The Morgan name means something now because of what you've accomplished." The acknowledgement was more than I had expected from him, but it was also 15 years too late to change the fundamental dynamics that had shaped our relationship. "I'm not calling to relitigate the past," I said. "I'm calling to tell you that I forgive you for not knowing how to include me in your family. But I also want you to understand that your exclusion taught me something valuable, that family isn't about blood or names or legal obligations. It's about who supports your dreams and celebrates your successes." "I understand," Richard said quietly. "I hope you do," I replied, "because the Morgan name is going to continue growing in recognition and respect. Every documentary I make, every award I win, every article written about my work will reinforce that legacy. I wanted you to hear it from me first." The conversation was civil but final. I had achieved the success that proved my worth, but more importantly, I had learned that proving my worth to Richard was never the real goal. Today, 5 years after winning my first Emmy, I continue to make documentaries that address social justice issues and family dynamics. My production company, Morgan Media, has become a respected name in documentary filmmaking, known for work that combines investigative rigor with emotional authenticity. The latest project, Inherited Responsibility, examines how children of powerful families choose between loyalty and ethics when confronted with their parents' mistakes. It's scheduled to premiere at Sundance next month, with early reviews suggesting it may be my strongest work yet. My relationship with my family has evolved into something more honest and sustainable. Mom and I talk regularly, and she's finally begun to understand that my need for independence wasn't a rejection of her love, but a recognition of my own identity. Marcus and Sophia have both reached out in recent years to rebuild our relationships as adults. They've acknowledged that they were protected from the family dynamics that made me feel excluded, and they've expressed genuine admiration for what I've accomplished despite those challenges. Richard and I maintain polite but distant contact. He sends congratulatory messages when my work receives recognition, and I respond appropriately. But we both understand that our relationship will never be warm or close. Too much time has passed, and too much damage was done during my formative years. More importantly, I've built the kind of family that I needed all along, a chosen family of collaborators, mentors, sources, and friends who support my work and celebrate my successes without condition. The Morgan name now appears in the credits of award-winning documentaries, on bestseller lists of published works, and in the speakers' bureaus of major universities. It's associated with integrity, courage, and the kind of investigative journalism that holds powerful institutions accountable for their actions. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came last year when I received an invitation to speak at the National Association of Real Estate Developers annual conference. The irony wasn't lost on me. The industry that Richard had built his career in was now asking me to address their members about ethical business practices and media relations. I accepted the invitation, knowing that Richard would likely be in the audience, or would at least hear about my presentation from colleagues. The speech I gave was professional and constructive, focused on how businesses could build positive relationships with journalists and maintain transparency in their operations. But I concluded with a personal reflection that I knew would resonate with anyone in the audience who knew my background. The most successful legacies aren't built on excluding people who might challenge your practices, I said to the crowd of developers and investors. They're built on embracing accountability and encouraging the next generation to exceed your own achievements. Today, the Morgan name stands for exactly those values: accountability, excellence, and the courage to challenge systems that need improvement. That's the legacy I inherited from my father, and it's the legacy I'm building for future generations who will carry this name forward. The speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it represented the completion of a journey that had started with a 7-year-old girl who just wanted to belong somewhere. I had spent years trying to earn a place in Richard's family, then years trying to prove that I didn't need his acceptance. What I finally learned was that the real victory wasn't in making him regret excluding me, it was in building something so meaningful that his exclusion became irrelevant. 3 months after that speech, I received an unexpected phone call from Marcus. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying an emotion I had rarely heard from him, "I need to tell you something that's been weighing on me for years." "What is it?" I asked, curious about what had prompted this sudden need for confession. "Dad's been following your career more closely than any of us realized," Marcus continued. "He has copies of all your documentaries, newspaper clippings about your awards, and he even subscribes to trade publications that cover your industry." The revelation surprised me. Richard had never mentioned being interested in my work, and his indirect communications through Mom had always been brief and formal. "He's proud of you," Marcus added. "He won't say it directly because he's too stubborn and too ashamed of how he treated you when we were kids. But he talks about you to his friends and business associates. He brags about your success more than he brags about mine and Sophia's accomplishments combined." The information was touching but also frustrating. If Richard was proud of my achievements, why couldn't he express that directly? Why did it take my brother's intervention for me to learn about his feelings? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I think you deserve to know," Marcus replied, "and because I think Dad deserves a chance to make things right before it's too late." "Too late for what?" Marcus paused before answering. "He's been having health problems. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to make him think about his legacy and his relationships. I think he regrets how things went with you, but he doesn't know how to fix it." The conversation left me with complicated feelings. Part of me was gratified to learn that Richard had been following my career with pride. But another part of me wondered why it had taken potential mortality for him to consider the relationship damage he had caused. I spent several weeks thinking about Marcus's revelation before deciding on a course of action. I wasn't ready for a dramatic reconciliation, but I was open to a more honest relationship if Richard was willing to take responsibility for his past behavior. I sent him a letter, not an email or a phone call, but an actual handwritten letter that would require deliberate attention and response. "Dear Richard," I wrote, "Marcus tells me that you've been following my career with interest. I wanted you to know that I appreciate your attention to my work, even if you haven't expressed it directly. I've spent many years being angry about feeling excluded from your family, and I've spent additional years trying to prove that your exclusion didn't matter. What I've learned is that both of those approaches missed the point. The point isn't whether I was ever truly a Blackwood or whether the Morgan name has become more recognized than yours. The point is that children need to feel valued and supported by the adults who are raising them, regardless of blood relationships or legal obligations. I don't need an apology for the past, but I would value honesty about the present. If you're proud of what I've accomplished, I'd like to hear that from you directly. If you regret how our relationship developed, I'd like to understand your perspective. I'm not asking for a relationship that erases the past, but I'm open to one that acknowledges it honestly and moves forward with mutual respect. The Morgan name will continue to grow in recognition and achievement, not because I'm trying to overshadow the Blackwood family, but because that's the legacy my father left me to build. I hope you can take some satisfaction in knowing that your household contributed to raising someone who has made a positive impact in the world." I mailed the letter on a Friday and tried not to think about it over the weekend. But the following Tuesday, my phone rang with Richard's number on the caller ID. "Victoria," he said when I answered, "I got your letter." "And?" I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "And you're right about almost everything," he admitted. "I was a poor stepfather to you, and I let my own insecurities about blended families affect how I treated you." The admission was more direct than anything I had expected from him. When Elizabeth and I got married, I thought the best approach was to treat you politely but maintain clear boundaries about who belonged in my family," he continued. "I was wrong about that, but I was also scared about taking on responsibility for someone else's child." "What were you scared of?" I asked. "Failing you the way your biological father couldn't help but fail you by dying," Richard said quietly. "I thought if I kept some emotional distance it would hurt less if something went wrong." The explanation was more psychologically sophisticated than I had given him credit for, but it was also heartbreaking in its short-sightedness. "Instead, you failed me by never really trying," I pointed out gently. "I know that now," he replied, "and I know it's too late to change how I handled your childhood, but I want you to know that I am proud of what you've accomplished." Marcus is right. I follow your career closely, and I brag about your achievements to anyone who will listen. "Why haven't you told me that directly?" I asked. Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was ashamed of how little I contributed to your success. You accomplished everything on your own, despite my lack of support, rather than because of it. I didn't feel like I had the right to take any credit or express pride in achievements that I had actively discouraged." The honesty was painful but also healing. Richard was finally acknowledging the impact of his choices and taking responsibility for the relationship damage he had caused. "You're right that you don't get credit for my professional success," I said, "but you also don't have to feel guilty about it forever. Children can succeed despite inadequate parenting, and parents can learn from their mistakes." "What would you like from me going forward?" Richard asked. It was a good question that I hadn't fully considered. What did I want from a relationship with the man who had shaped my childhood, but never really accepted me as family? "Honesty," I said finally. "When you're proud of something I've accomplished, tell me directly instead of telling Mom to pass along the message. When you disagree with my choices, say so respectfully instead of making passive-aggressive comments. Treat me like an adult family member rather than a former obligation." "I can do that," Richard replied. "And Victoria? Thank you for building something so meaningful with the Morgan name. Your father would be proud, and so am I." The conversation was a beginning rather than a resolution, but it was more progress than I had thought possible. Over the past year, Richard and I have developed something resembling a normal adult relationship. We talk directly rather than through intermediaries. He attends my documentary premieres when his health permits, and he's even provided helpful insights for projects that touch on real estate industry practices. Most importantly, he's begun treating me like a family member whose opinions and achievements matter, rather than an outsider whose presence requires explanation. The relationship will never be warm or close. Too much time passed and too much damage was done during my formative years, but it's honest and respectful, which is more than I had dared to hope for. Meanwhile, my career continues to flourish in ways that exceed even my ambitious expectations. Morgan Media has expanded to include other documentary filmmakers whose work aligns with our mission of accountability journalism. We're developing a fellowship program to support young investigative reporters who want to pursue documentary filmmaking. The Morgan name is now associated with a brand of journalism that has influenced policy changes, inspired other media investigations, and given voice to people whose stories might otherwise go untold. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came last month when I received a letter from a college student who had watched my documentaries as part of a media studies course. "Dear Ms. Morgan," she wrote, "I wanted to thank you for creating work that addresses family dysfunction and power dynamics so honestly. I grew up in a similar situation with a stepfather who never really accepted me, and seeing your success has given me hope that I can build something meaningful despite that difficult foundation. Your films taught me that family rejection isn't a judgment on my worth, but a reflection of other people's limitations. I'm now pursuing a career in investigative journalism, inspired by your example of how personal experiences can inform meaningful professional work. The Morgan name means integrity and courage to me, and I hope to contribute to that legacy through my own future work." Reading that letter, I realized that my stepfather's rejection had ultimately led to something far more valuable than his acceptance could ever have been. It had motivated me to build not just a successful career, but a meaningful legacy that honors my father's memory while inspiring others to overcome their own family challenges. Richard had been right about one thing: I would never truly be a Blackwood, but he had been catastrophically wrong about what that meant for my future. I was always meant to be a Morgan, to carry forward a name associated with truth-telling, integrity, and the courage to challenge powerful institutions. His exclusion from his family had freed me to build something more significant than I could have achieved while trying to earn his approval. Today, when people hear the name Victoria Morgan, they think of award-winning documentaries, investigative journalism that creates social change, and a production company that amplifies important voices. The Morgan name is recognized and respected in ways that the Blackwood name never will be. And every time Richard introduces me to his friends and business associates, every time he mentions my latest project or achievement, every time someone asks him about his stepdaughter who won the Emmy, he's forced to acknowledge that the name he wanted me to abandon has become far more prestigious than the one he wanted me to adopt. That's not revenge exactly, it's something better. It's proof that when someone tells you that you'll never be family, the best response isn't to keep trying to prove them wrong. The best response is to go build your own legacy so compelling that their rejection becomes irrelevant. So what about you? Have you ever felt excluded from a family or group that should have welcomed you? How did you channel that rejection into motivation for building something meaningful? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about turning family dysfunction into personal triumph. Remember, the people who reject you today may be watching your success from a distance tomorrow, wishing they had been wise enough to support you when it mattered. And remember that sometimes the greatest gift an absent parent figure can give you is the motivation to succeed without their approval. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your last name is only as meaningful as the legacy you build with it. Make it count.